Okay, this is for the 131 classes. And I first have to apologize for being a little bit incommunicado for a bit. First of all, I was kind of depressed by the fact that nobody's watching these videos. I went to reorganize my YouTube page, and when I saw that most of the videos had no more than 15 views, it was kind of distressing. I thought, oh, why bother doing them? But I've also been pretty troubled by the, not so much by the election, but by the behavior of President Trump in the wake of the election. And it's probably not the right thing to talk about that, but that's not the way it's been done for for hundreds of years. I think 1800 was the first time that a member of the opposition party got elected, and it was a pretty fierce campaign with people claiming that Jefferson was a French revolutionary and was going to set up guillotines and kill people, behead people. And on the other side, they accused Adams of being a tyrant and fixing to make himself the king of the United States. But once the election was over, and it was a complicated affair that went to the House of Representatives, Adams packed his bags and left. And that's the way it's gone ever since. The guy that lost conceded, and the guy that won started making plans to be the president. So the 2020 election is a very novel and very troubling kind of thing. I've asked that you write a second paper on the civil rights movement. I had originally planned 3 papers. One was on Reconstruction, one was going to be on the Depression, and one was going to be on the civil rights movement. I've cut out that second one, although a couple of people went ahead and wrote their papers on the Depression, and that's okay. I will accept those as the second papers. If you'd rather write about the Depression, go right ahead. I'll give you a choice there. I'm not sure if I can get through this with my cough, but anyway, the heat has come on, and it's made things troublesome. So the civil rights movement the first paper was on Reconstruction, and for the period from the end of the Civil War, 1865, to 1877, when the troops are pulled out, there is a brief period where African Americans in the South are able to vote, able to elect all sorts of local offices and state offices, and even send people to the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? But even before the troops are pulled out, there's pushback from white Southerners to sort of limit the power of the Republican Party in the South. And that continues after the troops are pulled out and becomes pretty much the way things are for another 100 years. Well, 90 years, okay? They use tactics like terror, just people showing up at your house in hoods, Ku Klux Klan hoods, threatening to burn you and your family and your house, lynchings. We saw that cartoon where Guys armed with guns and stuff like that would show up at polling places and demand that African Americans vote for the Democrats, which they didn't want to do. They were Republicans back then. Later, it becomes literacy tests that not only limit blacks that can vote, but also limit poor whites, uneducated whites that can vote. And that becomes, that's not a problem for, as long as some part of the white population gets to control the elections, they don't care what's happening to other poor or uneducated whites. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes of one kind or another that the state would claim that the elections were expensive and they had to charge people to vote. All of that is now illegal, but was sort of the common thing. Okay. I did see something on, I think it was on Prime Video about, I can't remember the title of it, about democracy, and it laid all of this out, and it was very informative. It gets to the point where by like 1960, there's only 3% of the blacks in Mississippi that can vote, that are able to vote, which is an enormously small number. It's a very small number. Coupled with this is the whole Jim Crow situation, okay, where the Supreme Court makes decisions that sort of undermine the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. They say that they apply only to the states, but private organizations, private companies can sort of discriminate. Okay, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 says separate but equal is constitutional. In a case involving train cars, okay, you can have a white and a black train car, and as long as they're equal, it's constitutional. You can separate the races. Okay, and this becomes written into the local law books all throughout the South. Separate water fountains, separate restaurants, separate hotels, or no hotels for black people, but a white hotel, a whites only hotel. Towns with one swimming pool, and only the whites can use it because there isn't a second blacks only swimming pool. Okay, and I've always had a hard time understanding what this was supposed to accomplish. But I've come to understand that if you're going to keep people in a sort of second-class status, you have to control their minds and control their behavior, and that's what segregation or apartheid is meant to do. Cause people to have doubts about their own self-worth and stuff like that. Black people, for the most part, respond as best they can, although it's a pretty scary situation where if you step out of line the least little bit, somebody accuses you of looking at a white woman, whether you did or you didn't, you could be hung and mutilated, and maybe your body burnt to a crisp at the in a number of hours, is something like that. There are an enormous number of lynchings going on, and lynching is basically a tactic. It's kind of random, comes out of the blue, can happen to anybody, and it keeps people. It's traumatizing to a whole population. Okay, so that's a situation coming into the 20th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, you have a guy named Booker T. Washington that comes along. He gives a speech called the Atlanta Compromise. And this is important because there's a number of strategies put forward for black people to follow, okay, in this situation of Jim Crow and lynch terror and stuff like that. And one of them is Booker T. Washington's sort of what we call the Atlanta Compromise strategy. He says African Americans should sort of talk right, dress right, not worry about political and their political rights and their civil rights, learn a trade. Don't try to get to, they have an expression in the South, don't get above your raising. And he's sort of suggesting that for African Americans, don't try to reach the heights. Learn a trade, make yourself indispensable to the white economy, to white people in general, and that's how you get along. Don't be too black, basically. And it's in the situation that people were in, it's perhaps a reasonable strategy. Okay? But beginning with the 20th century, you get a guy that's almost diametrically opposed to Washington, and that guy is W.E.B. Du Bois. And I don't know what the W.E.B. stands for. It's 3 initials. He's part of the progressive movement. He's a Harvard PhD. I think he's the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. I think it's in sociology. I'm not 100% sure. He writes a number of very well-received books. One of them is on Reconstruction, and is probably at the time the best description of Reconstruction, because it's from an African American point of view. And The Souls of Black Folk is another one of his books. And he in 1905 he takes part in a meeting called that's going to lead to the formation of something called the Niagara Movement. And they have a meeting in Buffalo of white sympathizers and black activists, and they're not allowed to meet together in Buffalo, New York. So they have to cross into Canada to have this meeting. And this points up an important thing. Although in the South, the Jim Crow laws are written into the ordinances, the local law books, in the North, there's segregation that's just sort of customary. I'm not even sure that it's a legal prohibition. But there are no hotels in Buffalo that will accommodate a mixed racial group. So they go across the river to Canada. That makes sense that segregation would spread to the north, because if you load up a train in New Orleans and it has separate black and white cars, there's no spot along the way like St. Louis where they'll suddenly mix them up. It'll go right into Chicago that way. And if it's leaving Chicago, it's going to leave with black and white cars. Okay, so lots of times people think of this as a Southern problem, but it's not only a Southern problem. Du Bois eventually founds an organization, and I think it's 1909, called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, colored people at that time was the proper term, I guess, used to describe African Americans. I know a couple of you used it in your papers, and I was a little bit. It's pretty antique at this point. And I wouldn't use it. Blacks or African Americans are probably the right way to go. But at that time, colored people, and that's still the name of the organization. They haven't changed it. The NAACP has a strategy of fighting court cases they're gonna acquire civil rights by sort of like doing the hard work of one court case after another, okay? And they will do that right through the whole first part of the 20th century until they build up all these precedents, and then they go into court in 1954 and get that separate but equal Plessy versus Ferguson thing struck down in with Brown versus the Board of Education, calling for integration of schools. All right. So you have the NAACP, founded in 1909. Now, one thing that's very important to understand in all of American history, particularly though in the civil rights movement, is there's hardly ever a nice, smooth progress to better things, okay? We'd like to think that, we'd like to think that like, oh, there was Reconstruction beginning in 1865, and then things just kept getting better and better and better and better and better. Not the case at all. It goes up, it goes down. Some of the worst periods for race relations are in the 20s. Lynchings go up. The Ku Klux Klan becomes tremendously popular among certain parts of the population. Okay. You have World War I. Black soldiers go off to Europe. I don't know the numbers, but there's a large number of them. They're still fighting in segregated units. Black soldiers in these divisions, these regiments, white soldiers in these regiments and divisions, okay? A lot of black soldiers experience a lack of racial animosity in Europe, particularly in France. The French seem to not care what your skin color is. There's no history of slavery in France itself, So they had that experience, and they think that coming back they'll be, they fought for their country. They should be able to get their rights and what's due them. And it turns out that like the summer of 1919 is filled with race riots. Chicago has a tremendous one. It's called the Red Summer because of the blood that's shed. You can read in the textbook about the riot in Chicago. Starts at a segregated beach. A young black man somehow drifts into the white water and gets stoned, and then blacks mobilized to go into white neighborhoods, and there's retaliation, and it's like a war, okay? And it's other cities as well. And in the 20s, it's 1915. There's a movie comes out called Birth of a Nation that makes heroes of the Klan, and it's like the first movie that tells a story. It isn't just like special effects and stuff like that, but it tells a story, and the story it tells is a terribly racist one. But it's very popular. It screens at the White House. Woodrow Wilson has a screening of it at the White House. He writes this blurb. It's like writing history with lightning, and all of that, and that gives the Klan, causes the Klan to come back into existence, and no longer only in the South. There are places like Indiana where the Klan controls the state house, the legislature, and here in New York, Binghamton is the center, the capital of the Klan in New York State. And they used to burn crosses up on South Mountain. I think I'm repeating myself, but anyway, there's all that. So the 20s are not a great time for for unions, it's not a great time for black people, and it's going to get worse when you get into the Depression. Okay, you get into the Depression, blacks get pushed out of the shitty jobs that they're already limited to so that white people can take those jobs. You know, janitors and stuff like that, they get pushed right out of those jobs into unemployment so that white people who had better jobs but don't have better jobs now can take those jobs. There's the New Deal is a pretty good thing for most of the country, but it doesn't do really well with issues of civil rights. Okay, there's a thing called the Civilian Conservation Corps that recruits young men, sends them off into the to forests to cut trails and clean up things and do these kinds of projects and stuff like that. There are segregated camps for the CCC of white camps and black camps and that kind of thing. When Social Security first comes in, it doesn't cover agricultural workers or domestic workers who are likely, you know, in that case, more likely to be black than other occupations. There's a lot of things that go screwy, okay? Then you get to World War II, and unlike World War I, which I sometimes think was completely pointless, World War II is a war against racism. It's a war against fascism, which is ultranationalism. And in the case of the Germans is racism directed at the Jews, okay? Hitler thinks of Americans as mutt people, sort of mongrel, mixed up people, mixed race people, and there's no purity here, that kind of thing. And black soldiers go off in large numbers to fight against Hitler and the Germans. I remember when I was a kid, I used to read these war comics, Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. And there was one story where there was a guy named Gabriel Jones. Gabriel Jones was a member of the Howling Commandos. They were U.S. soldiers. And he had the right blood type to save this German soldier, and they gave him a transfusion. And the German soldier was kind of horrified that he had now had black blood in him, you know. And it's one of the places where I learned, you know, what the content of Nazism was. That it was this racial thing. They banned jazz music, the Nazis, because it was you know, N-word kind of music, that kind of stuff. And for the most part, African American soldiers thought that when they came back, like in World War I, they would be welcomed as heroes and begin to get the kinds of rights that they thought they deserved by fighting for the country. Right? It's not what happens in the South, particularly. There's a sort of the sight of a black person, a black man in uniform, kind of outraged many whites, and there are stories of people being thrown off a bus, soldiers being thrown off a bus, and then lynched by a mob of white people. So after that. So that's the situation coming out of World War II. I left out a couple of things, but Marcus Garvey particularly, who's pretty important. But coming out of World War II, You still have segregated units in the military. Schools are segregated. The whole Jim Crow apparatus in the South is segregated. Black people basically don't vote in the South. I'm not sure how much they vote in the North, but in the South, it's next to nobody that votes. And the first thing that I consider, the first event that I consider as part of the modern civil rights movement, is not mentioned in our textbook. Here, I put it over here. Jackie Robinson is not mentioned in this textbook, which I think is a shame, because to my mind, that's where you get the entire country thinking about segregation and civil rights and, why should we treat people certain ways. Black people, of course, always think about that, have always thought about that, okay? You grow up in the South as a black kid, and you're confronted with it. Only white people can sort of ignore that, the discrimination and the Jim Crow and that kind of stuff. But bringing Jackie Robinson up to the Brooklyn Dodgers and putting him in a major league team uniform and sending him around the country to play baseball leads to stories on the back of every newspaper in the country about the issue of race. You can't talk about Jackie Robinson without talking about race, and I think that's where the issue becomes sort of raised for white Americans. Okay. And there's a good movie, 42, that displays some of this stuff. I like to Google odd combinations of things and see what comes up. And years ago, I Googled baseball and communism. And one of the things I got was the fact that there's a communist newspaper in the 30s called the Daily World or the Daily Worker that was pushing to break the color line in baseball back then in the 30s. That was like one of the issues that the Communist Party of the USA was pushing. Who knew? I never heard integration in baseball connected to that, but there it was. Walter Rodney, I think, was the author that they were talking. It was his campaign in that newspaper. So that brings up the issue, okay, at the highest levels of professionalism and stuff like that. And it makes you wonder, there's only eight teams in each league, 16 teams. It's a very small number of jobs. The most southern team was Cincinnati. There was nothing further south in the major leagues than Cincinnati. And still, it's still like you're wasting an entire talent pool by keeping those people out. Okay. Now I don't know if I'm going to do much more tonight, but I'll have to do it. I won't get to it until Friday, I don't think. But anyway, the very next year, Truman signs an executive order that integrates the military. And, there's all sorts of objections to having white and black soldiers in the same units. And of course, none of them proved to be true, People are able to get along, or they're not able to get along, but it doesn't cause disruptions, and the military goes forward and gets integrated much more smoothly than schools or any other institutions will get integrated. Okay, so this is 1948. I mentioned 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. The Supreme Court decides that separate but equal cannot be constitutional. All right? Now, the other thing to keep in mind now is that by 1954, you're more or less deep into the Cold War. And Americans are trying, it's not a real war. People aren't shooting each other on either side. I don't think there are any casualties between Russia and the United States in the Cold War. But it's mostly ideological. People claiming that communism is a terrible form of economy and a terrible form of dictatorial government. The communists are claiming that we squeeze poor people and we let people die on the streets and stuff like that. It goes back and forth. The civil rights movement is going to become like inserted into this larger ideological battle. And it's going to become, in some cases, people regard the treatment of blacks as an embarrassment that we should fix so that we can look better to the rest of the world and the Soviet Union. And that's part of it, and it becomes a big issue. All right, so let's leave it at that. The Supreme Court decision is made in '54. It doesn't lead immediately to school integration, but it's starting. Okay, it's starting, and I'm going to post this tonight, and then I'll have another one, the more exciting one. Maybe Thursday, I'm not sure. Bye-bye.